This has been a truly extraordinary conference, and I'm sad to say we are entering our last panel. However, you can expect it to be an amazing one. So now we will turn to the Buddhist world in Asia and beyond, and it is my honor to introduce as our first speaker, Lobsang Sangay, who you know for many reasons. He is, of course, a colleague here at Harvard, so many of you have studied with him. You have experienced for these past 2 days his extraordinary vision that put together this conference, his amazing organizing skills, and also just his sheer presence in the room and the impact it can have in terms of inspiring all of us. And has already been mentioned, luckily, more than just those of us who happen to be in this room and those of us who happen to be colleagues and students at Harvard have also experienced this. He is indeed the Emeritus Sekyong. I'm not sure if Emeritus Sekyong is even a word, but I'll stick with Bill's term. But he was the Sekyong for 10 years and did an absolutely extraordinary job and is bringing that same vision to us here in this conference. So please join me in giving our very warmest welcome to Lobsang Sangay.
Thank you, Michael, for the kind words. Unfortunately, today we are not live streaming. I wish Tibetans would hear what you have to say so that, I get a ringing endorsement from a very prominent professor at Harvard that my term as a Sekyong was a very good one.
It was an extraordinary one.
So thank you very much for all of you. And to be in the last panel is always a disadvantage because people have spoken all the things that need to be spoken, and you're left with not much to say. But then, as the topic of our panel is Buddhist world in Asia and beyond, there's a geopolitical element. I just want to bring it to, try to bring it to a current issue. In October this year, just last month, China organized the World Buddhist Congress. And Chinese Global Times claims that 800 delegates from 71 countries participated. Then in November, just this month, a few days ago, Delhi organized the first Asia Buddhist Summit with 600 delegates from 32 countries. So you can clearly see, China is doing it, and then India is following it. Why I mention this is because Tibet is also a vital issue. When I was Sekyong, it was in July. Doklam had just happened. That's the border dispute, between India and China. Mainly, Doklam is in Bhutan. The Chinese 20,000 troops came to Doklam, and then Indian troops had to go up and then push back. There was a standoff, and continues to have a standoff. And a few weeks later, we were celebrating His Holiness Dalai Lama's birthday. I happened to be in Delhi, and then I met this Indian journalist. He said, "Lobsang, I'm going to Tibet now, and then to China." And we are 7 of us journalists. We're going, and we are given free access and all kinds of, travel visits. And then they came back after 10 days or so. 5 or 6 Indian newspapers, you can Google, all have same headlines. China will choose this, the next Dalai Lama. India cannot interfere. Can you imagine 6 or 7 newspapers in India, same headlines, So Doklam happened, still China sends a message. And then Galwan happened, that's in 2022, where again 50,000 Chinese troops came to the Ladakh area, and there's still a standoff between India and China. Why I say this is the whole border of so-called China and India was actually a border of Tibet and India. So there was no demarcation, and the dispute arises. So when we talk about geopolitics and Dalai Lama's reincarnation, because it's not just Tibetan and 6 million Tibetans, whole of Himalayan belt, that's India, then Tibet, you move up Inner Mongolia, then you move up Mongolia, then you have to move up to Russia, actually we call it Outer Mongolia or Mongolia. That borders up north is Puett Republic and Tuva Republic. Both are Buddhists, both follow Dalai Lama as their spiritual leader, right? And then you have Kalmyk on the Europe side. So you're looking at the whole territory. If you look at the map, it's a huge territory. And on the eastern front of India, then you have Burma, Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, Singapore. So you're talking about, geographically a huge territory where it will have an impact when it comes to selection of reincarnation of Dalai Lama. And then not just in Asia and beyond. How many of you know the third largest religion in Italy, where the Rome is Buddhism? Right? Fifth largest religion in France is Buddhism. And in America, all over the world, because 14 Dalai Lamas traveled far and wide, and many Buddhist teachers from Asia have traveled to Western countries and beyond. So it has major global importance and significance as well. Now the question was raised whether we should end the institution of Dalai Lama. I would put forth an argument and say, why should we? Mainly because for 800 years we have practiced reincarnation, selection reincarnation. It has been a very successful, industry or tradition. Having said that, all the abuses that we talk about, scandal and corruption, it's all there. But we have internal mechanism to root it out. The reincarnation process is very democratic, right? You can be a very high Lama. If you go to the history, many high Lamas, lineages have disappeared, mainly because there was a corrupt system process and they choose a wrong one, and then they lose faith, they lose followers, and they lose donations, and the Labrang disappears. So it's very democratic and transparent one. So we have mechanism where we can root out the weak ones and then carry on with the strong ones. With the institution of Dalai Lama, if you look at all the 14 Dalai Lamas, we can reasonably claim of the 14, 9 Dalai Lamas were very successful. First to third, and the fourth was Mongolia, who died at the age of 27, who could not do much. Fifth lived long and established Ganden Podang and ruled over Tibet. And sixth, again, died young, but he turned out to be a great poet. So his contribution as a poet, his poem in praise of his, mistress or girlfriend, it's widely, read and very popular in the Tibetan, culture. And seventh and eighth, as a religious figure, were quite successful. It's just 9, 10th, 11, 12th, who died at the age of 21, 18, 14, maybe 24. And then the 13 and 14 were very successful. Now, of the 14 Dalai Lamas, 9 were successful. Of the remaining 5, unfortunately, one from Mongolia died very young, but 9, 10th, and 11, 12th all died young, which coincided with the Golden Urn, 1793 ordinance, and Amban interference, and many historians say that they were assassinated, killed, or poisoned just before or at the time they took over the sovereignty or rulership of Tibet, right? So except for China's interference, right, actually the institution of Dalai Lama has been very successful. So, Mr. Shen Weirong said, perhaps we should free Bodhisattva from samsara, take politics out of religion. If we take Beijing out of institution of Dalai Lama, we are doing quite well. Because if you take Golden Urn, if we have used Golden Urn in selecting the Dalai Lamas, claimingly, 9, 10, 11, 12 Dalai Lamas, all died young. So Golden Urn is a bad luck for institution of Dalai Lama. Okay? Even if China uses Golden Urn, likelihood that that boy is going to die very young is very high, because 100%, 4 of them died before the age of 24, right? So we have to take, if you have to take samsara out of Bodhisattva, we have to take, I think, Golden Urn out of the Dalai Lama selection process. Now, why I say this is because, if you look at what Chinese government is trying to do is, they have come up with this order number 5. This is a regulation in selection of the Dalai Lama, right? But if you analyze it further, you find that till 1990, Chinese government didn't have any law or regulation in selection of any reincarnated lamas. Okay, we have hundreds of them. Chinese government didn't bother. In 1990, they just woke up and said, we need a regulation. Why? Because His Holiness Dalai Lama won Nobel Peace Prize, and Panchen Lama died. Then said, oh, we need a regulation now. They came with a provisional regulation in 95, right? Why? Because Panchen Lama had to be selected now. So they invented the regulation post-death of Panchen Lama. Then finally they said 2007, oh, we need to have a regulation to regulate all the tulkus, all the reincarnated lamas. So order number 5, if I may. So, this long preamble which says that all the lamas has to be born in Tibet. And then essentially you can say, they have to respect the state as more important than spirituality, all that. So a reincarnated living Buddha shall not be interfered with or be under the dominion of any foreign organization or individual. That's one of the regulations. But then the flaw of the order number 5 is that in 2007, when the regulation came, they recognized 300 lamas. But then April of 2017, they had 700 reincarnated lamas. That's registered, April of 2017. But in August of 2017, it increased to 1,300, from 700 to 1,300 in 4 months' time. 700 more than double. And then Jambe Gyatso, he's still in Tibet. He is now perhaps the senior most Communist Party member. He said corruption. How can you have, double the number in 4 months when you didn't have, so many lamas in 10 years' time? So he named, there's a huge open letter if you read. So if you want to implement the order number 5 for any reincarnated lamas, including Panchen Lama and Dalai Lamas, people inside China, even Communist Party members are saying corruption, it's misuse. Oh, I thought I had another slide. Anyway, so China is trying to control the selection of reincarnated lamas inside Tibet. That's order number 5. Now, if I expand it geopolitically, as I mentioned, Dalai Lama's influence in Russia. Now, increasingly with Ukraine war, right? Russia is dependent on China at the moment. Now, that is being used as a leverage. And then religious leaders in Puett are coming under tremendous pressure. So you might know His Holiness Dalai Lama has not been allowed to visit Russia for more than a decade. Now, what we hear is that Puett group is under tremendous pressure to invite Chinese Panchen Lama. There's a delegation, a Puett delegation of the president and all. They had to go to Beijing and meet with Chinese Panchen Lama. Now, Kremlin wants to organize, like India and China, major Buddhist conference, and where Chinese Panchen Lama will be invited. Now, Tuba is another republic where Dalai Lama is also a leader. Now, Tuba's religious Buddhist community is essentially, I don't want to say controlled, but influenced by Sergei Sogo, the former defense minister of Russia who invaded Ukraine. He's from Tuba. By the way, he claims to be Orthodox Christian, okay? We believe that. But in Tuba, actually, it's 0.6% Orthodox Christian, the majority are Buddhist. They follow Dalai Lama. So his foundation controls Tuba's Buddhist community. And Kalmyk is far off. They are also coming under tremendous pressure, from Beijing to Kremlin to all this region. Now, Mongolia is also coming under tremendous pressure now. Haga Jinzu Thamba's reincarnation was recognized by His Holiness Dalai Lama. He, it took some time, and he was recognized, and in Dharamsala. But then, who becomes his teacher, right? All these are under tremendous pressure. Now, Beijing is saying, oh, Kaga Jinzu Thamba should come to Beijing. We will provide you teacher. We will provide you monasteries. We will provide facilities. And then Mongolia is under tremendous pressure. So, the geopolitical significance of this is already being played out. Now, interestingly, the governor of Tibet Autonomous Region and the party secretary of Tibet Autonomous Region, they are, leaders of domestic issues. But now they travel to all the Buddhist countries, to Nepal, to Burma, to Thailand, to Singapore, even Maldives. Maldives went through this food crisis. Beijing donated 1 million bottles of water of Tibet to Maldives. And who went to deliver? The leaders of Tibet Autonomous Region. So you can clearly see Beijing is laying out the groundwork, in Southeast Asia as well. So, and then putting pressure on India. So that's how, if you look at all this and then you say, Beijing is already has a game plan. And then as Tendor said, even if we want to think of reforming the institution of Dalai Lama, Beijing is not letting us do it. So that's another important point that I want to make. And then do I have a few minutes? 3 minutes left. Yes. Now, inside Tibet, we don't know what will happen in the post-case scenario. Because for us, His Holiness Dalai Lama is life and soul of Tibetan civilization, Tibetan identity. As Tendor gave many anecdotes, I do remember meeting a Tibetan lady in the plane flying from Dharamsala to Delhi. And she was very reluctant, but she recognized me. And after somebody started talking, she said, you know what, I saved for 10 years and I applied for passport. For 10 years, I bribed every official in Tibet and China to get a passport for one wish. Come to Dharamsala, see His Holiness Dalai Lama. I've fulfilled my desire, I'm going to go back. Now imagine Tibetans in Tibet. What will happen if His Holiness passes away in exile? So worst case scenario, there could be major uprising in Tibet. And Beijing should be cognizant of that. And best case scenario, we hope it will be best case scenario. But my fear is that the devotion and the faith the Tibetan people have, and for His Holiness always express a desire to visit Tibet, visit Wutaishan Mountains for pilgrimage. And this request has been denied time and again. And Tibet inside Tibet know this. And Tibet outside also, we all know this. Right? And then so for us, and geopolitically, institution of Dalai Lama has major geopolitical ramification, not just in Asia, even in Europe and America as well. So with that, I want to end, and hoping my colleagues, Dibyesh, he has agreed to, break legs, right? And Josh is always a very eloquent speaker, and they will do the heavy lifting. So cheers.
Great. Thank you for such an incredibly powerful talk. And let us indeed turn to our next speaker, Josh Rogin. I'm very honored to introduce. Josh is a journalist currently at the Washington Post. His many writings on Tibet, China, and U.S. politics are always must-read pieces, as his tremendously exciting, or powerful, I should say, not exciting, powerful book, Chaos and All Under Heaven. And I'm happy to say he is here not only constantly thinking through what is going on in Tibet, and will continue to do so, very actively thinking through what is going on in Washington, and that will undoubtedly play a very key role the next few years as to how things will be playing in Asia as well. So please join me in giving our very warmest welcome to Josh Rogin.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Lobsang. Thank you all for including me in this wonderful conference. It's just been such a respite from what's going on in Washington, and really feels like a big hug, a community effort to really come together and understand and share and get to know each other. And I just wanted to say thank you so much for making me a part of it. For this sake of full disclosure, as a journalist, I am by definition not an expert on anything at all. Okay,
Not true at all.
I have no advanced degrees. I have no research papers. I can't really engage in the discussion of the the history or theology of Buddhism, but I can talk about policy and politics, and I plan to make the argument to you here today that these issues are connected in ways that we should talk about openly and honestly. And as Michael mentioned, my history is that I've spent about 20 years covering U.S.-China relations in Washington. I wrote a book about U.S.-China relations in the Trump era, which is still available for purchase wherever books are sold.
And a very timely book.
And over the course of that 20 years, with the help of many, including especially Lobsang Sangay, I've often written about the Tibetan struggle for dignity, human rights, and autonomy. And that has often involved covering the activities of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Now, I'm sensitive to the idea that the study of Tibetan Buddhism and the Tibetan struggle for human rights are not the same thing. And often, as I've heard this weekend from some new friends, the interests may not be always perfectly aligned. But with that in mind, let me try to explain to you the connection between the two of them as I see it, and then give you my take on what we're looking at with the next Trump administration and its Tibet policy and its China approach writ large. My exposure to the Tibetan cause started in '98 as a sophomore at the George Washington University attending the Tibetan Freedom Concert, which some of you may have also been at. Anyone? No? Just me? Okay. No problem. But the first article that I wrote about Tibet was in 2007 when I was a congressional reporter for Congressional Quarterly, and I covered the Congressional Gold Medal ceremony for His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And I remember like it was yesterday. There was George W. Bush, Robert Byrd, Mitch McConnell, Nancy Pelosi, not people who agreed on much at all, especially at that time. And Nancy Pelosi said to His Holiness Dalai Lama, "You have brought peace to the U.S. Capitol." And as far as I can remember, that's one of the last times since that I've seen any signs of such bipartisanship. I think it was during the Obama administration, actually, that the issue of His Holiness the Dalai Lama became, let's say, politicized. And what I mean by that is that I remember in 2009, and I covered this at the time, as one of her first acts, President Obama's top strategist, Valerie Jarrett, traveled to Dharamsala and told His Holiness the Dalai Lama that he wouldn't be invited to the White House in President Obama's first year because President Obama wanted to make an outreach to Beijing, and this would interfere and complicate those plans. When His Holiness the Dalai Lama did come and eventually visit Obama in the White House in 2010, you may remember there was a series of concessions made voluntarily, I think actually preemptively, to Beijing to dampen the blowback, including having the meeting in the map room and not the Oval Office, having the Dalai Lama walk out the back door rather than the front door, where photographers quite unfortunately captured him having to step over piles of garbage. And, for me, this was the first time that I thought that the U.S. government had set the precedent that they would play ball with China's demands that their treatment of the Dalai Lama could be considered a sensitive matter in the relations between Washington and Beijing, subject to negotiation without the Tibetans being in that room. Now, that kind of leads us to the topic that we're here today, which is the issue of the reincarnation of His Holiness the Dalai Lama and its political and geopolitical relevance. And as Lobsang Sangay taught me and has laid out very elegantly, the reason that it's politically and geopolitically relevant is because the Chinese government insisted it be so. And they view it as key to their efforts to control not only the international activities of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, but to control all Chinese minorities and Chinese religions, to Sinicize religion, and to control the narratives about China and their treatment of minority groups and human rights in the international sphere. And, I remember, you may think that the Trump administration, wasn't really great about human rights, but I was there. I can tell you it was actually a much more complicated story. I remember, again, at the invitation of Lobsang in 2017, I traveled to Dharamsala and for the 550 Forum, and that was the first time I had a chance to really interact with His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And so I asked him, it was October 2017, Trump was president. I said, "What do you think of President Trump?" And he thought about it, he laughed, and then he thought about it, and he said, I'm paraphrasing slightly, but he said, when I first heard the term America First, I thought, not so nice. And then he sort of laughed, and then he said, but the American people are good people. They believe in democracy and freedom and human rights, and I trust them. And then I asked him, do you want to meet President Trump? And Lobsang intervened and said, next question. A couple months later, when Lobsang came to Washington to testify before the House Foreign Affairs Committee on this issue, I got a tip from one of my sources. They said, Josh, you're not going to believe this. There's a delegation of Chinese government authorities from Tibet, the people who had come all the way from Tibet, who were party officials, who are meeting with a bunch of senators on the other side of the Capitol. And sure enough, they had counter-programmed your visit, you remember? And these gullible senators had allowed themselves to be used as tools of the Chinese government's propaganda. And sure enough, later that day, there were 20 articles in English and I'm sure other languages about how the U.S. Congress supports the Chinese government's, benevolent care of Tibetan culture or something like that, and the environment. And U.S. Congress loves everything that's going on in Tibet. And those 20 articles far outdrowned my one article about Lobsang's actual testimony about the real situation. It just goes to show you how far the Chinese government will go to influence these narratives, especially in Washington, using all sorts of means and corruptions. I think the Trump administration came in with a strategy similar to the Obama administration of engagement first. I think every administration basically does that. If you'll remember, they didn't immediately go to tariffs. They started negotiations, and then when those failed, they went to tariffs. And, then they went back to negotiations. And so the first thing you need to understand about any Trump administration is that no China strategy is ever final, no China strategy is ever set. It will certainly change and then change again, often unpredictably, sometimes for the better and sometimes for the worse. So on human rights, it certainly was a mixed picture. I remember when I interviewed President Trump for my book, and that was a crazy hour of my life that we don't have time to get into right now. But on the issue of human rights, I asked him, I said, what do you think about the China's treatment of the Uyghur Muslim minority, which your administration declared was a genocide? And he said, Josh, maybe they know how to secure their borders better than we do. That's what he said. And I said, okay, what do you think about the Hong Kong, struggle for democracy and autonomy? And he said, well, Xi Jinping knows how to deal with rioters. Maybe we can learn something about that from him. That's what he said. So this is how President Trump as a person feels. That's his true core. He doesn't care about human rights. He certainly doesn't care about Tibet. And for him, all of these issues are just complications in his desire to buddy up with Xi Jinping for, sometimes confrontationally, sometimes not so confrontationally. But it's pretty clear that whenever these issues reach the level of his awareness, that's really bad for the human rights cause. A couple levels down is a totally different story. And, I remember, when Secretary of State Mike Pompeo convened a United Nations conference in New York on behalf of the Uyghur Muslims. 31 nations sent representatives, victims testified. I'd never seen anything like that before or since. We have someone here from the International Religious Freedom Bureau. They were particularly active and empowered in the Trump administration under former Senator Sam Brownback, and who went out of his way to elevate the Tibetan and Hong Kong and Uyghur causes with great effect, I think. I again, whatever your preconceptions are of what a Trump administration might bring to the table, let them go. We don't know. And this will be the subject of internal fights that have yet to play out. And those fights will certainly have already started. Okay, so then we get to the Biden administration. Well, again, not to be overly critical of our State Department colleagues who are in the room, but the fact is that they've pushed a lot of these issues back under the rug. And President Biden, never lifted a finger to try to meet His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And when I remember before President Biden met with Xi Jinping in San Francisco for the November summit last year, right beforehand, Secretary of State Antony Blinken did his perfunctory meeting with like the Tibetans and the Uyghur and the Hong Kong community representatives. That's like you have to do that before you have one of these leader meetings. And so he did it, but they refused to release the photo. Seems like a kind of a small thing, but that photo for these groups, for these activists, that's all they weren't going to convince Secretary of State Blinken to change the policy. That photo was the deliverable. We bothered them for months. It's never been seen. I've never seen it. Right before President Trump left office, he signed a bill, a big appropriations bill, after he had already lost the election. He didn't think he lost, but that's a different story. And in that bill, there was an amendment. And that amendment is called, I can't find it here, but here it is, the Tibetan Policy and Support Act. And what did that do? That made it an official law, a matter of U.S. policy enshrined by a law, that the issue of the reincarnation of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, as a matter of U.S. policy, is to be determined solely by the Dalai Lama and his representatives, and explicitly not by the authorities in Beijing. Right? I've never seen anything like that before. How is that even in the jurisdiction of the U.S. Congress? It's probably not. But it's in there, okay? And he signed it, even though I'm sure he wasn't aware of it. And then he left office, and the new administration came in, and they certainly weren't aware of it. And I know that. I can prove to you that I know that, because I went on in July 2023, I went on a trip with Vice President Kamala Harris, and we went to Jakarta, Indonesia, for the ASEAN meeting and the East Asia Summit. And I spent about 5 days with her and her staff and her Asia staff, and then National Security Council Asia staff. And you get a lot of time with these people, that you don't really have access to as a journalist most of the time, on the plane and hotels and, traveling all around Jakarta. And so finally I found the woman. I'll spare, for the sake of the cameras, her name. I'll spare her the embarrassment, but she's in charge of this issue for the National Security Council, okay? And I said to her, hey, it happens to be U.S. policy that the reincarnation of His Holiness the Dalai Lama should be determined by the Tibetans and not by the Chinese authorities. And she looks at me, she says, that's not true. And I said, I'm sorry, but I think it is, in December 2020. And she Googles it, right, on her phone as we're saying. She's like, oh, what do you know? Turns out that is true. And I said, oh, well, okay. So it would be nice if at some point some U.S. official uttered that in public, so that people would know and people would be aware of it. It would have more effect anyway if people if that was somehow reinforced by this administration in some sort of way. Oh, yeah, that's interesting. Okay, yeah, we'll get back to you on that. Never heard anything. So then later on in the trip, I had a chance to meet with the Vice President Harris, and interview her, and we had some time to talk. And I said, it would be really important, I think, if someone from, the top ranks of the Biden administration met with His Holiness the Dalai Lama. She's like, what do you mean? I'm like, well, Trump didn't do it, but before that, every U.S. president in modern history has met with His Holiness the Dalai Lama. It's pretty symbolic. It's pretty important. Well, the travel schedule. I'm like, how about a Zoom? I can, I'll introduce you to the people on Signal right now, and we'll get a Zoom together. How about that? Oh, yeah, okay, well, let me think about that. Nothing ever happened. And when the Dalai Lama was in New York for weeks and weeks and weeks, he was visited by, the Undersecretary of State. It was a qualified, official, very nice person, all respect for her in the world. But it's pretty low level when you consider the other options. So now we're going to have 2 successive administrations where nobody in the top levels of government has decided to bother to meet with His Holiness the Dalai Lama. It's a problem. So we can tackle some of these issues in the question and answer, but I think before I sort of want to close, I sort of want to make a couple of points. When His Holiness the Dalai Lama shuffles off this mortal coil, the Chinese government certainly will recognize their own version of his successor, and then strong-arm governments all over the world to agree with that. And I think the question that I have, and that many of you in this room may be having right now, is what does the U.S. government have to do with that? Why is it any of our business? What grounds do we have to even opine, much less weigh in on any of that? And I can answer that from the U.S. perspective, from the congressional perspective, which is that, I believe, and I think many people in the U.S. government believe, that we have a national interest in the United States to support religious freedom, human rights, because that's in America's interest, because generally the promotion of these values contributes to our interests, and the perpetrators of atrocities tend to be dictatorships that are working against our interests. So we have I get it from the U.S. perspective, but what about for the Tibetans? And I think what has maybe gone unspoken is that the Tibetan, if the U.S. government fails to stand up for the version of reincarnation supported by His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the Tibetan diaspora and the Central Tibetan Administration, that will hobble their efforts to rally the international community to support them. In essence, other than the Indian government, the U.S. government is the only real organization powerful enough when it wants to push back against massive Chinese disinformation and propaganda efforts. And it's very effective when it chooses to do so. We just don't know if it's going to do so in this case. In other words, without U.S. government intervention, Beijing's plan will have a much higher likelihood of succeeding. And again, this is not an academic point, this is a policy point, but if that happens, I think that could be a devastating blow to the Tibetan diaspora and exile communities' efforts to rally international support for Tibetan human rights and Tibetan political autonomy inside the Chinese system. The Dalai Lama's passing will be the closing of an era where he personified the Tibetan cause, an era that lasted more than 60 years, and without an alternative to represent the cause, who has the credibility and I would even dare say the affection of Americans, the visibility of this issue could further suffer. Therefore, in a sense, the issue of the Dalai Lama's reincarnation is really also about the reincarnation of the Tibetan human rights movement, for which he is the main avatar. And that reincarnation is also important and also already underway and potentially deserving of its own entire conference. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for a tremendously insightful talk. We will be following all of your articles over the many years to come. You have such a sense of
And
what is
subscribe
going on,
if you
its
are inclined to the
Yes,
Washington Post.
do.
We're down subscribers, you may have heard.
They were all worth reading, so thank you. That was absolutely wonderful. And I am now honored to turn to Dibyesh Anand, our final speaker, unfortunately, for today, but it will be an amazing one. So Dibyesh, of course, is visiting us from the University of Westminster, where he is currently the Vice Chancellor. He is an extraordinarily wide-ranging scholar. I'm sure there are topics he has not written a groundbreaking book on, but I can't think of too many offhand. He has written books on representations of Tibet, rethinking international relations by a deeper understanding of geopolitics, current politics right now in India and exactly what is going on behind the current parties, and truly one of these figures who is able, through his wide-ranging scholarship, to rethink most of the world around us that we thought we understood and then suddenly are forced to see in a radically new light. So please join me in giving our very warmest welcome to Dibyesh Anand.
Thank you, Michael. You saw I already stood up because I'm excited about this. And of course, for you it might be tiring, etc., but hopefully you understand while it's coming to an end, we have had an amazing conference. I just wanted to thank all of you, particularly Lobsang, for organizing it. And I wanted to start by, okay, and I'll see the time, so don't worry, you can show me the time when you have to, is we started talking sensitivity, right? I mean, often when we have any discussion on Tibet in general, or Tibet's relation with China, we talk of the sensitivities involved. Just bear in mind that there is a strong weaponization of sensitivity by China in these cases. Frankly, these conversations should not shake anything in Beijing if they didn't care, but they are very good, and Chinese government is very good at using the idea of sensitivity in every different context. Whether a leader meets the Dalai Lama or an academic writes an article, or you say anything about Tibet which doesn't conform into Chinese regime's viewpoint, it would be seen with sensitivity. And they have been winning that battle in the West, frankly, including in not West, but also China. That's one thing to bear in mind. But there's second sensitivity involved, and that was alluded to yesterday in terms of possibly someone in Dharamshala. But that sensitivity is not the same sensitivity. That sensitivity is one of beleaguered, exiled, precarious, refugee population that's trying to survive. So there's a two kind of sensitivity, one of a colonizing power and one of a colonized population and those in exile. So I just wanted to bear in highlight that part. We haven't talked of colonization. We haven't talked, in fact, even use the word occupation possibly here. Though for me, this entire subject is very closely connected to Chinese occupation of Tibet, Chinese colony of Tibet. So I wanted to emphasize on that. So the very fact I'm talking of colonization and colonial occupation, I can expand that, and I've done that in my own work, so you can Google for it and read it later. I'm not going to expand on it here, is we can't, so imagining a depoliticized discourse on reincarnation when it comes to Tibet is a fantasy. We might hold on to that fantasy, but it's not the reality. Again, and the reason for that being a fantasy at this point in time, again, is because of the elephant in the room, which is Chinese colonization of Tibet. Till that colonization is not over, we cannot talk of a depoliticized understanding of what is going on, specifically into reincarnation, the second point. Third, and as I hope I've highlighted, I know some of us talked about both sides, but both sides are highly asymmetrical. It's good, especially those of us who work on Tibet and Tibet, we like to think there are two sides, and I wish there were, but there's a difference in terms of the power. That asymmetry has to be acknowledged. Because ultimately, the main idea that governs the world is of sovereign statehood, the state sovereignty. As a scholar of international relations, I look at state sovereignty, and that state sovereignty is very clear: absolute, legalized, recognized authority over territory and population. That territory has to be demarcated, particular kind of notion of boundary, and boundary exists. Yes, we can talk of past when these things didn't exist, but the reality today is when you come here to the US, you need a visa. If you need a visa, passport, whatever, and wherever you go to China, you need a visa, passport. So we know that we live in a very world dominated by sovereign nation states. Right? So reincarnation, which defies sovereignty, which defies the idea of nation state, how do we deal with a concept of reincarnation, lived reality, and you said it's more than belief, it's a lived experience, lived reality, knowing that the world is divided into nation states. And that's a huge struggle. That has been my interest here. And in fact, while listening to others, I was going back to read my own article I had written in the Guardian newspaper in 2010. I thought, will I change anything? No, not at all. So you can go and read it later from 2010 on Dalai Lama. And I called it the China's Dalai Lama, because it's not China's Dalai Lama. If they ever fantasize having another Dalai Lama, which they control, you can read that later. I'll cover some of it. But given that the world is sovereign state, some would see, tempting to see it's a tradition versus modernity. China is a modern nation state, and Tibetan tradition is basically traditional. And that has often been a bane of understanding Tibet, where Tibetans are seen as nice, cuddly, really religious people who are not fit to govern themselves. And we have seen that over the last 100, 150 years. And that has benefited at one time British in early 20th century, and later PRC. PRC has been very good at, again, giving this impression of Tibetans being almost otherworldly, so religious that they're not fit to govern themselves, then to justify colonialism. But the reality is, when we talk of Dalai Lama, he's a very modern Dalai Lama. And as some of you have pointed out, it's the Chinese government that's now claiming to represent the tradition by saying he has no right not to reincarnate, and we will reincarnate him for him, even if he doesn't want to reincarnate, right? That's how it's functioning there. Now, one would think, given the China's confidence and power, immense power, and frankly, no other government can do much with China, why do they need to go back to golden urn? And they don't need to, right? In one, they could just say, look, we control Tibet, you can whatever off, right? They can do that. But they don't. They always go back to legitimacy. And that is because, of course, the Tibet issue, the reincarnation issue, the Dalai Lama issue is not only about Tibet. It is also about the very legitimacy of the Chinese People's Republic of China. People's Republic of China came as a liberator of all people in China, and all those they occupied as made as part of China. They are the liberators. So for liberators to acknowledge they're colonial doesn't work. Except that if you look at how they operate, it's colonial. So therefore, even if you say, oh, but some of your practices are colonial, it's not. Because, why not? Because we have been victims of Western and Japanese colonization. As if those who have been victims of colonization cannot be colonizers themselves. Take example of the US. Take example of, many other countries. But I'm just highlighting that part. So the reason why China claims that long history is because of legitimacy part. I'll not expand on that. But there is a problem. And again, I'm not... Those of you have talked about the Qianlong, the golden urn, and problematic aspects of it that you highlighted, how possibly whether it works or not. The way I would see it is quite different. At that time, there was at least some kind of shared belief between the rulers and the Tibetan. Lamas, right? There was a shared belief. That's not the case. There was no concept of Han supremacy, at least within Qing Empire, the Manchus. That Han supremacy is very much there. And third and most importantly, the rulers, they were not atheists. And rulers now are atheists. So in that sense, even that legitimacy, even if the documents were correct, would not hold true because PRC is not a success rate, though even in international law they'll claim to be success rate. But when it comes to reincarnation, they cannot be a success rate because of the nature of the state there. That's what to bear in mind. So why do I call it colonizing nation state? If I'm too fast, too bad. I can repeat it for you during dinner or something, but I have so much to cover. It is. Colonialism is very much clearly about asymmetrical power. I will control you because you're not fit to govern themselves. I will develop you. There's a paternalism, right? If you don't want it too bad, we'll still rule you for your welfare. That's typical colonization. Economic control, social control, cultural transformation, control over every aspect of life, control over knowledge. We know China and Tibet. Again, I've worked on that, written on that. You can read that later. So how does it function in this particular context? And as Lobsang and others pointed, order number 5, right? So Chinese government could say, but look, we don't interfere. We're just trying to govern, right? So every modern nation state would govern. Sounds fair, right? The thing is, order number 5 talks about China Buddhist Association as the one that will look after this. If China Buddhist Association was autonomous from the Communist Party, you would think, fine, maybe there's a government body that's trying to govern, and many nation states do. Except China Buddhist Association is United Front Work Department. And United Front Work Department, not even government, it is Communist Party. So we have a situation where it's not actually the government, it is the governing party, a communist party, therefore an atheist party, that is the ultimate authority. And as many of you pointed out, the main focus is to get patriotic lamas, not anything else. Now, and I was going to do a quiz, but it doesn't work because Jigme already pointed out Bhutan does the regulation. They did it before. 1969, 30th session of National Assembly of Bhutan in 1969 for the first time brought in how to deal with foreign reincarnate lamas. And the idea is if a Bhutanese boy was found, and the idea was Tibetan Lama, right? Bhutanese boy was found as a reincarnation of a Tibetan Lama, and they decide to leave the country, they lose their citizenship of Bhutan. That's there, right? That's there. In 2005, they solidified that rule. So Bhutan did it before China did, right? But what I would argue is that Bhutan's governance and looking at that was not to delegitimize reincarnation. It was to, like Qianlong for instance, even like Qing's to some extent, was to bring some sense into it and balance between the interest in this case of the nation state of Bhutan, but also the religious belief of people. So it was meant essentially not to dehumanize, not to bring down Buddhism, but it was to help it flourish in a proper manner. What about India? India's approach towards reincarnation has been quite agnostic, means they don't interfere unless it goes through the court with Karmapa, we know. And Indian government can mess up things like Karmapa issue, badly messed up by Indian intelligence, parts of Indian intelligence. But as a principle, they are agnostic. They will not try to control it, but they'll try to deal with whatever they get. China's approach towards reincarnation is very clearly not about governance. It's not about control. It's about domestication, ultimately. It's to domesticate it. It does, it's not a surprise that from 200, 300 living Buddhas, there are now thousands, maybe 10,000, who knows, and they'll be all around. There's a whole political economy around it, right? If I were one, if I didn't have much to do, if I could come across a living Buddha, I will become one. It brings a lot of wealth and power. So it's there. Now think of, but what I would argue is it's very much part and parcel of conscious policy and approach of PRC to have this situation where ultimately there'll be a loss of faith in reincarnation on the part of Tibetans. And this is something to bear in mind. So definitely having more and more reincarnation, which then leads to all kinds of confusions, is not an accidental byproduct of Chinese policy, but very much a conscious part of it. Because ultimately what they want is not that belief system to continue, not that living system to continue, but a disbelief, at least amongst Tibetans, on what is happening. And that can be done through this generation of corruption, generation of multiple lamas and multiple reincarnation. That confusion helps. So that's very much part and parcel of it. So it's a messy feature we're looking at. I'm not covering the Dalai Lama, 50 Dalai Lama, again, that's in one sense partly relevant, but not fully relevant. One thing I would bear in mind is, as some of you have pointed out, one thing about reincarnation is very clear, and it's not messy. And other things could be complicated, nuanced, and as scholars, we tend to always look for nuance and complications. But with reincarnation, it's quite clear that if I can, sorry, I'm an atheist person, I can be sacrilegious in many terms, so you can ignore me for that. So if I am the reincarnate Lama and I want to reincarnate, ultimately it's me reincarnating, right? So my wishes matter most. So ultimately, it's not about state sovereignty, not even about Tibet, it is about my sovereignty to come back. So since the Dalai Lama has made it very clear that he has said many things, right? He may take reincarnation as a woman, not take reincarnation, can do X, Y, Z. But one thing has been consistent, by the way, that he would not reincarnate in Tibet till there's a political resolution between China and him. Okay? That's very clear. So what power and authority does a atheist communist party have where it tells the manifestation when it passes away from 14th Dalai Lama and it goes into 15th, that somehow you didn't want it but will still transform you. So if they have that power, it's remarkable. Then we are living in a different kind of world, right? But as we can see, that absurdity points out that ultimately it's about an illegitimate claim over reincarnation. And finally, I'll take a couple of more minutes. That's it. I can see that. It will come soon. That for me, and again, Tibetan reincarnation and the issue of Dalai Lama is not an issue of only Dalai Lama. It's not an issue of Tibetan Buddhism, as many have started highlighting from beginning till the end. What we did, it is very much about the very existence, the very idea of Tibet as having a distinct identity and Tibetans being a distinct people. Whether that Tibetan identity is genuine autonomy within China or independence from China or XYZ, living within China, but the reality is they are a Tibetan people, and this reincarnation thing goes back into that very heart of existence of Tibetan people as a people. And in that sense, I would argue that, and I know we talked of it, the struggle in 1920s in Soviet Union was after the Communist Revolution was between anarchists and one of the struggles, of course, there was between others and communists, but communists and anarchists. And if you look at reincarnation, it's a very anarchist kind of, and we talked about it, right? Bottom up, etc. It's a very anarchist kind of approach compared to the communist approach, which is very top down. That's one thing to bear in mind. And as we pointed out, it can be very democratic because it can be found anywhere. Therefore, it's not driven by hierarchies of other things. So we have to remember that part. Those are part things. Ultimately, what I would say, and I'll end with this, is acknowledging that China, and again we can expand here, its colonial rule in Tibet, the issue of reincarnation, therefore, and who has the control is ultimately a prerogative of the Dalai Lama and Tibetans. That's something we have to hold on to. So regardless of where it came from in US, I'm glad US did it. I wish India does it. I wish more countries do it. At the very least to say that, you know what, we acknowledge the right of Tibetans to decide for themselves what happens to the primary institution that they have coalesced around. So ultimately, therefore, the reincarnation question is a question of Tibetan self-determination. I know that's not a word we have used so far, but I wanted to end with that so that we go back to think, yes, it is about various other things, history, present, religion, belief, etc. But ultimately, it is about the right of Tibetans to be a people and decide for themselves and determine for themselves what kind of institution should they have. And conclusion, and someone was saying, newspaper article or something, everyone dies, even the Dalai Lama. I was thinking, every empire collapses. And there's no reason to think that China or PRC as an empire will not collapse one day. Thank you so much.
Wow. Thank you for an absolutely wonderful talk. If 15 minutes ago you thought I was exaggerating when I said how eye-opening and extraordinary Dibyesh's books are, you are undoubtedly now convinced. Go to Amazon.com, or even better, the Harvard Bookstore. We need to save our independent bookstores and buy his books immediately. They're all like this, just incredibly eye-opening. So thank you so much. So 3 absolutely extraordinary talks that have raised many questions, and therefore let us turn to them. So if I could see hands of those who would like to ask questions, and please, and even though you have spoken, if I could ask you to introduce yourselves anyway, just because people are sort of coming and going throughout the day, so please. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Like, oh, great, thank you so much.
I can also yell, but
Although for the recording, we do need the microphone. So
Thank you so
yes.
much. So
Great,
my
thank
name is Sinsrema Yujid, and I teach Tibetan Buddhism at the University of Michigan. So when we're talking about the Tibetans, as all of you have, then obviously there are the Tibetans in Tibet, and then there's a diaspora community, and they're subject to very different, pressures and so forth. So in that context, is there, if at all, a difference in the way these different groups of Tibetans identify with or value or kind of see the Dalai Lama? Different, if at all, in the way the Tibetans in Tibet and the diaspora community in what what His Holiness represents for them?
I think inside and outside Tibet, vast majority have very similar views, because we always say Chinese Sikituba, the manifestation of Buddha of compassion, Gyalrumche, Kundun, even the term that we use for him is exactly the same. Having said that, I'm sure there are some Communist Party members, who are indoctrinated, who are true believers, and they might have different views. So that's why the Beijing has imposed a regulation that all the Communist Party members in Tibet, Tibetans, they are not allowed to visit and circumambulate, monasteries. But then I was told they buy bikes and then, they just bike around the monastery, Potala Palace, for health reasons, but generally, I think we all see him, Dalai Lama, as this, in a very similar way.
Thank you. And Dibyesh, please.
I just wanted to add to that again. So the senior most Tibetan person in Chinese government, he visited my university, where, by the way, I've had His Holiness the Dalai Lama, I've had him, I've got the current Sikyong, so we always get people from different sides. And I did ask something similar from him. And his approach was, my mother used to respect, but I don't. I said, what will happen if the Dalai Lama comes now? And that upset him, but I could also see the expression. Now, what I wanted to highlight based on that question, though that's not, is that sometimes what we notice in Western academy is that particularly non-Tibetan scholars, I'm also not a Tibetan by the way, non-Tibetan scholars have seen that they would often distinguish between, this is the exiled Tibetan view, what about the real Tibetans inside real Tibet? And then they will claim to speak for the real Tibetans. And how can they claim to speak for the real Tibetans? Because they get access to Tibet through fieldwork, which most Tibetans can't get. I just wanted to put it forward to all of you. Please be wary of that approach, where you suddenly find, I shouldn't say white people, but often it's white people, white scholars who would compromise on everything vis-a-vis China, have visits, and then come back and tell you that Tibetans in exile somehow are disconnected and they know what the reality is. So just wanted to use your comment to highlight that.
If I add one comment, actually there's a compilation of letters sent by previous governors of Tibet Autonomous Region. Okay, when they were governors, so they have to follow the party line and they say all the things, Dalai Lama clique and all that. The day they retire, next day they have again, till Cheng Zemin, they have written letters to Cheng Zemin and Hu Jintao, others saying, by the way, I've been a governor of Tibet Autonomous Region, but if you want a real solution, you must talk to Dalai Lama. So even the Communist Party members, okay, they have their letters said, so even they acknowledge that Tibetans in Tibet revere His Holiness Dalai Lama far more than the Communist Party of China. So in a way, even the Communist Party, if Baba Phunzo Wangge, Ngabe Jigme, Panchen Lama, of course. Other than that, other governors also, they all have written letters to Chinese leadership.
Thank you. My name is Tendor. I have a quick question about the connection between international law and reincarnation. If we try to imagine something there, in order to protect people's rights in the future, because when you bring up, there may be lamas who want who want not to be reincarnated, and if states or other people or companies still go on and reincarnate them, that seems like a violation, definitely, right? So it depends on, it's a matter of consent in that sense. So is there a way to imagine a place for reincarnation and rights related to reincarnation in international law? And if there is, which body of international law might be that type of place? Because I think declarations are not going to work, because you can't really have, it's hard to imagine a UN declaration that goes, all human beings are reborn free and equal, But I wonder if there is room in international law related to privacy, for example. Because nowadays there is people are pushing for something called on the internet, the right to be forgotten, the right not to be on the internet, right? You can choose. So, is there a room there in privacy or right to be forgotten? Are those models applicable to something like the right not to be reincarnated, and that we should protect that particular type of right?
Actually, we have Nordinla here, who she just did her master's degree from Harvard Law School. She has written, a paper on international law and reincarnation. So at an individual level, it's human rights, means it's your choice. Consent is very important, right? So, and from religious freedom point of view, also is very clear. It's, you have freedom, it's yours. But at a macro state level, so can Beijing claim, as per international law, that's this again talking of colonialism and all that. Can Beijing claim to have the transfer of the power as far as golden urn is concerned? There is a hereditary and there's something called continuation, something like that. Can they claim? But then the Michael Van Wall's book, based on international law, has clearly argued that there is disjointed. So Beijing present PRC cannot claim the continuation of the same empire of Qing and Ming, and Professor Lau also says that. So both at a macro level and at a micro level, either from human rights point of view, international law point of view, argument can be made that Beijing has no right over it.
Sure. My name's Nicole Willock. I'm associate professor at Old Dominion University in Norfolk, Virginia. I actually have a question for Josh about the press and the role of the press in this. Lobsang also mentioned how basically Indian reporters, I think, were kind of fed a certain line by the Chinese government. How influential is that in our press right now? I mean, you're in the field. I was just wondering if you could comment on that. How influential is Chinese influence here, especially in this kind of age of disinformation with these bots and so much of these kind of the trolling incident with His Holiness last year. I can think of with the tongue thing and all of this stuff is this disinformation. I feel is one of the things that academics have to confront, but it's hard to know how the actual press system works and how these things get just spread like wildfire. So I was just wondering if you could comment on that.
I might challenge the premise of your question that the press system works. Yeah, but sorry, I'm being glib. Listen, I've written a lot about not just Chinese government disinformation, but Russian government disinformation, Iranian government disinformation, U.S. government disinformation, for that matter. Let me answer you very quickly in two separate ways. One is, let me give you my take on the mainstream press, which I've been a part of for the last 20 or so years. And basically the way it works is that we have corporate pressure and corporate interests that are not direct, they're indirect. So just as one example, when I got to the Washington Post, they would run an insert every so often that looks like the Washington Post, but it's actually a China Daily insert. And they never came to me and said, don't write about Tibet. It's not that direct. They never came to me and said, oh, you know what, this whole thing that you've got with interviewing the Dalai Lama, can we back? That's not the way it works. But my article might be smack dab next to a China Daily insert, or this is a real example, that says, Tibet's wonderful, the Chinese government's benevolent, everything's hunky-dory. And a reader probably couldn't even distinguish that. So I went to my bosses at the time and I said to them, this is no good. You know what I mean? You're muddying up your own product and you're also enabling a propaganda effort to covertly be fed to our readers. It's not true, and it's actually, to the detriment of the human rights of these people that we're talking about. And they were like, shut up. Don't worry about it. Stay in your lane. So that's on one level you have that. Then you have another level in again, sort of mainstream media of partnerships. So there was a time period where, I wrote about this too, where Chinese state media outlets were very interested in forming corporate partnerships with U.S. state media outlets all over the world, but especially the U.S. ones that I was focused on. And it would look like, oh, the Associated Press just signed a data sharing agreement with Xinhua. I'm like, oh, wait a minute, let's have a think about that. What does that mean? So I would call up the Associated Press. Hey, what does this mean? Well, we can't really talk about it, but it's AI and economic data and user data. And I was like, but you realize you're sharing Americans' data and technology with the Chinese government's propaganda outlet. Yeah, don't worry, everything's fine. Go back to your knitting. So there's that. Then there's content partnerships. So this could be a little bit more subtle. So you'll have like an American outlet that shares copy with a state media outlet. You're like, wait a second, how does that happen? Did we vet that copy, or did we just run it? Often they just run it. They don't know what they're doing. So there's just 3 examples of how a very extensive United Front and Chinese Communist Party information operation is directly trying to compromise and the trips. One day my boss was like, oh yeah, I went on this trip to Xinjiang, and they took us, my boss wasn't a China expert, he was just telling me this, and they took us to this farm, and the Uyghurs were singing a song about, how wonderful Xi Jinping was, but it was kind of weird because there was no, there's nothing on the farm. They're tilling empty soil and singing songs about Xi Jinping, and it was kind of Orwellian, but, I'm like, yeah, that's a propaganda trip. How did you end up on that trip? Well, it was, don't worry, Josh, it wasn't funded by the Chinese government, it was funded by the China-U.S. Exchange Foundation, which is a think tank. It's not affiliated with the government. And I was just like, I'm sorry to be the one to tell you this, but that's actually a United Front organization that is, part of their, propaganda and intelligence and influence operation apparatus. And you just became a victim of that. You didn't even realize. You still don't even realize it. That's my boss, right? Just full disclosure, he doesn't work there anymore, so I'm not talking about my current boss. It's a guy who has long since left the Washington Post, so that's just that's 4 things just off the top of my head. Now, I think the broader question you're asking is what is the effectiveness of these methods? And now they don't really do that much anymore because the readership of mainstream media is way down. It's much more effective for the Chinese government to affect Americans through its own platform, mainly TikTok. Not just TikTok, but mainly TikTok. And I'm like, mea culpa, I'm addicted to TikTok. I was scrolling last night until 3 o'clock in the morning, and when I should have been preparing for this event, they got their hook in me. But I started for research purposes. And anyway, the point is that it's lousy with Chinese propaganda, mostly through the voices of Americans and Europeans and other Westerners who, not necessarily because they're paid per post, but because the incentives built into that algorithm and into that system point you in an obvious direction, which is to, say that, the Uyghurs are all liars and terrorists, and the Hong Kongers are all rioters, and, everyone in Washington who criticizes the Chinese government is a warmongering neocon like Josh Rogin, right? That's what you'll see on TikTok, and I see it in my feed all the time. Maybe it's because I like and save all of those videos. I don't know. It's kind of a self-reinforcing system. But anyway, that's by far dwarfs any of the corporate stuff at these days. So for the first 15 years or so, it was all of this infiltration into sort of U.S. corporate media. Now it's just about skipping them and getting to Americans through the filters that they're actually using. And it's amazingly effective, and it's changing the perceptions of an entire generation, fought valiantly against by other members of the younger generation who are speaking the truth and doing amazing things and deserve a lot of credit for countering those narratives on a daily basis. And I don't think we empower those young people enough, frankly, if I'm being honest about it. But no, the amount of resources that they've come to, not just controlling and censoring discourse, but doing what I think of as cognitive warfare, framing the reality of people through their devices such that they're not so much anymore as worried about the information environment, they're worried about the environment between your temples. And it's a much more direct route of influence, and they're much better at it than we give them credit for.
Yeah, if I may add, for example, Facebook is banned in China, Instagram is banned in China, Twitter or X is banned in China. But then they use these platforms to infiltrate into the Western world. For example, the CGTN, Chinese Government Television Network, right? If you look at the Facebook account, has 123 million subscribers, 123 million subscribers, okay? BBC has 60 million subscribers. CNN has 50 million subscribers. Al Jazeera has around 20 or 30 million subscribers. Combine these 3, Chinese government television network or Facebook has more subscribers around the world. This is only English language, not Chinese, English language. So can you imagine, they have banned Facebook in China, but they're using Facebook to infiltrate around the world, and they have more subscribers than all the major, TV networks in, the Western world combined. So they're that intrusive. In Africa, 8 to 13% of Africans watch CCTV, right? More than CNN and BBC. So in some countries. So they have become that effective and intrusive. So now they're bypassing, right? And then they're using these platforms to, interfere and influence the Western world.
Now, I will finally give voice to this side of the room, although I do know there are hands on this side too. And why don't we take a couple of questions, and then we'll return to this side of the room. So please, yes.
Thank you. I'm Allison Bartel. I'm with the U.S. State Department, the Office of Undersecretary Zaya, who is also Special Coordinator for Tibetan issues. My question is for Professor Anand. You said that it's the conscious policy of the PRC to provoke an ultimate loss of faith among Tibetans in reincarnation. And I just wonder if you can unpack that a little bit more and how that intersects with a goal of using this Dalai Lama succession process as like a key lever of legitimacy.
Pat Giersch, History Department, Wellesley College. So it's nice to see you, Michael. I wanted to follow up on that, and we've talked a little bit about inside Tibet versus outside Tibet. I was also really struck by the effort to try to undermine, or the comments about the efforts to try to undermine reincarnation, and sort of what, if anything, is being built to sort of replace that as a connection to the Chinese nation, perhaps? In other words, what's being undermined is a sense of community and belief and so on, and just very simply, does the CCP even have the vision to try to replace it with something else?
Typically, like any colonizing nations, if you look at what is China seeking to do, one is, of course, undermine the traditional religion and parts of traditional religion that allowed for separate identity of Tibetans. So those aspects of Tibetan Buddhism that do not directly lend itself to separate identity, they're okay with it, right? Then the whole notion of the singing, dancing, happy Tibetans, like happy Tibet, that is something that is being used. They use development as a mechanism of control very rapidly and very brutally, but also with strong confidence. But for majority, and if we look at Chinese nationalism in today's time and what we read about a lot of Han Chinese views about Tibet, it comes from a very benign position and also almost like hurt that we have done all this for Uyghurs, we have done all this for Tibetan people, and look, they're still thankless. So the whole notion, therefore, is which Chinese state is using is, in one sense, by using divide and rule policy, which is what they have been done, is that to remind, in one sense, give a sense to Han Chinese that Tibetans are getting privileges, which Han don't, so it leads to resentment. But vis-a-vis Tibetan, it's mainly development that's being used. That's there. Now, in terms of course, they are aware that Tibetan Buddhism and aspects of it, Tibetan culture is quite attractive for Han people. And that's very obvious. And therefore, the focus is so much on, so long as the messages of Tibetan lamas that are not political, according to Chinese Communist definition, they're allowed to function, but anything that's political will be stopped. When I say political, anyone who talks of Tibetanness. And we have seen various examples where lamas and the monasteries have flourished in 1980s and 90s, then they're crushed when they become too powerful. That's there. Now, Karmapa, if you take example of Karmapa, who's now in Canada somewhere, he had strong respect in parts of Tibet and parts of China. He hasn't said anything explicitly political in many years. And yet, anyone who's been to Tibet in the last 15 years knows that not only his monastery, the development have been stopped, the road has been stopped, and there's almost next step. If he ever says anything political, they'll crack down on that. So that's there. Coming back to it, consciously, if you look at 2005, 7 until 2008, China, in my reading, did not do anything explicitly to undermine. Yes, to control was there, but they did not do explicitly. But partly that's to do with the Olympics, partly to give the idea that, of course, they're opening up to the world, and partly Xi Jinping was not there. Right? You have to take all these dynamics. Specifically, in the last 10 years, there's a lot of focus on letting 1,000 lamas or reincarnate lamas flourish, so long as they are by wider society and not by Han Chinese. Many Han Chinese do respect them. It's Tibetans who are losing faith. That's what's happening, right? So what we find, of course, with the Panchen Lama, I have been to Tibet in the past, not in recent times, where Panchen Lama was supposed to come. I mean, the Chinese appointed Panchen Lama, not the Panchen Lama, the China appointed Panchen Lama, and you could see most Tibetans left the place. There is a particular Lama, Lama Gangchen. He's a very Shugden, one of the prominent Shugden worshipper. In case you don't know, it's a very divisive, I would say, ultra-right, far-right, in that certain context, extremist cult, which most Tibetans don't worship, and Chinese government encourages. It's based. So he was there. The moment he entered into the room, every single Tibetan left. And I happened to have met him in the past, and I speak Hindi. He spoke Hindi. So I said, "Hi, Lama ji, kaise hain aap? How are you, Lama ji?" And the Chinese officials around him got shocked because they couldn't understand what I was saying. I was not saying anything to him, by the way, other than saying hello, because I just noticed how others reacted. So I'm just coming back to the point that Chinese government, partly conscious, it is a conscious policy, is doing everything possible to undermine. They can't undermine the Dalai Lama ultimately. They know it. That's why they are so, they're so particular about controlling what happens around him. But they are out there to undermine the very belief in reincarnation and anything that they can't control. And they have been doing that specifically since Xi Jinping came to power.
If I may add, in the historical context, China, PRC, did destroy 98% of monasteries and disrobe 99% of monks and nuns, and all the scriptures, according to records, submitted Panchen Lama called 70,000 characters, clearly show that almost 75% of the ancient artifacts, the treasures that we have been lost now forever. They're melted, they're sold, all that. Now, how they are making Tibetans lose faith is, for even now, if you want to join a monastery, every monastery has a Communist Party cell. Right? You have to pledge your allegiance to the Communist Party and then denounce Dalai Lama. Sometimes you are made to step on the photograph of Dalai Lama while you do that, right? Now, this registration process where you have to register to be recognized Lama, you are in a way delegitimizing in the eyes of Tibetans because that's controlling. When the Communist Party gives you a certificate, Tibetans will call you Gyalama, your Chinese Lama. Right? So that's how they are trying to create fiction within. And then it's a small anecdote, but Ten Panchen Lama, who was very much respected by Tibetans, married a Chinese woman. Right? Phakpa, who became the most prominent Lama, also married. So by instead of remaining celibate, if you are made to marry, thereby you are again in diluting the credibility of Lama. So that's how they try to, force Tibetans to lose faith. But having said that, now there's a resurgence of faith and the revival of monasteries. So, it's back and forth. They destroy, rebuild, they destroy, rebuild, And then Serta monastery, which we talk about, has 20,000 monks and nuns, of which 2,000 or 3,000 are Chinese. That's the largest monastery in the history of Tibet. It happened during, in Tibet now, but then they destroyed half of it now, so they had to chase all the Chinese followers as well. So it has been constant battle, but then it's a matter of faith. So Tibetans are very devout followers. So it's not that easy to destroy or dilute our faith.
Hi, my name is Yiga. I'm currently an undergrad at the college. So my question is to Dibyesh. So I really loved how you applied the decolonial analysis for the Tibetan cause, especially related to how China claims that they are not a colonial power because of the Japanese and Western colonialism. So my question is, how can decolonial frameworks challenge the PRC's claim that its governance of Tibet is not colonial but merely administrative, specifically given that asymmetry of power and the deliberate undermining of the Tibetans' self-determination?
Very quickly on that, again, please do read the article I've written, and not others have written too, but very few of us have argued that in academia. So I want to use that question to raise questions of how decolonial and post-colonial theory in Western academia is dominated primarily by seeing mainly West as colonial and non-West as almost always as victims of colonization or just copying them, but never colonial in their own right. And I've been working on that for years. So 25 years ago, for the first time, I talked in International Relations Circle about post-colonial approach and looking at China and Tibet. We had a session 25 years later to talk about, has IR or post-colonial IR become much better in acknowledging colonization by non-Western countries? Not at all. And that is something very peculiar, especially I think it's a affliction, if I can use that, in US academia in particular, where the whole decolonial post-colonial, of which I'm also part, by the way, right? I mean, Western one, is that there's a complete refusal to see China or India in Kashmir context, or Turkey vis-a-vis Kurdish context, or there's so many other contexts, Iran, others, as ever being colonial or colonizing. And China was one because, of course, I know of people who work on Tibet, people who worked on Uyghurs. We use that framework increasingly, but we are mostly isolated. Now, in Tibetan studies, anyway, those who do politics international, we are marginalized because Tibet studies is dominated by certain notions of Tibet, which ignores contemporary politics in name of sensitivity. But I would also say they're complicit in that sense indirectly than with the Chinese occupation. But even the wider decolonial angle, we have to push back against it. So, very rambling, but this is a call to you. You're a student, and I'm sure there are other students. If your professor says, oh, you know, colonial doesn't work, decolonial doesn't work, maybe you look at only Israel, Palestine, or look at only US and Native Americans, say, why not? If one is genuinely anti-colonial, which is what decolonial should be, then it should not be about West and non-West. It should be about any colonial context and colonized context. So I would urge all of you as students to explore more the post-colonial angle, but put it back on non-Western powers, because that's hardly scrutinized.
We deserve it.
Yes, thank you. To reiterate, my name is Chotso, and I graduated from Harvard College in 2023. And I'm really interested in pursuing a future in law and international law specifically. I think I want to thank all three of you for speaking. It's been really interesting here, an IR perspective, a press perspective, and of course, a government perspective. And I think I feel kind of mixed right now. I feel really inspired from hearing you speak, but I also feel very angry and feel a little bit pessimistic by this notion that I am an American citizen, but culturally I'm Tibetan, and that my cultural identity so inherently depends on my national identity, and that there seems to be a failing by our international community to recognize the Tibetan issue, and then how the Dalai Lama the reincarnation of His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama is a very cultural and religious aspect, but now it has been politicized. And maybe for Tibetans and amongst Chinese, we can figure it out, right? Like there'll be a decision. But then a lot of it also will depend on the international community, like Professor Anand mentioned, to the resurgence of the Tibetan human rights issue. That's not very much a question, but more to see how can we maybe, as Tibetan youth and also people interested in human rights, kind of change our perception to feel more optimistic about this situation, and also call upon more, non-Tibetan leaders to pay attention to this issue.
Great.
Yeah, I feel the same way. I feel, a little bit enlightened, a little bit angry, and a little bit pessimistic. So I'm catching your vibe perfectly. There's a couple of things I could say. One is that, we're here to talk about the issue of reincarnation, and then we're broadening it out to the issue of Tibetan human rights and cultural preservation. And in my experience, the broader issue has been, at least in the Washington context, very disjointed over the years. And we shuttle back from this focus to that focus. Now we're working on reciprocity. Now we're working on access. Now we're working on encouraging a resolution between Beijing and the Tibetan leadership. Now we're working on reincarnation. And for the muscle memory of Washington, the government and the Congress and the NGOs and that infrastructure, right? That is all sort of focused on more keeping the machine going. It's what we call in Washington a self-licking ice cream cone. Okay, it's a system that's main goal is to perpetuate its own existence, and it's failing in that because of, I think, a lack of sort of strategic vision and a lack of consistency. And frankly, it's not alone, because overall all the human rights causes in Washington are also suffering from a lack of visibility and awareness, and they're just getting drowned out by corporate interests and overall apathy in the system, and the rise of lots of other conflicts around the world that are demanding our attention. So what I've often said, and I'm inspired by the youth activists mostly is that the case has to be made again to the American people in a broad sense. And that I saw that vibrantly during the 2022 Beijing Olympics. This was like a moment where the world's attention was captured, and very smartly and very courageously, not just Tibetan, but Uyghur and Taiwanese and Hong Kong youth came together to raise awareness. And it worked. And for a certain amount of time, everyone was back on the same page that this is an important issue that, that Americans, but also people around the world should care about. But then it fell off. Okay, and there wasn't any follow-up or consistency. And, you know, in Congress, the people who came up in the Richard Gere generation, no offense to Richard Gere, is a lovely person, I'm sure, they're leaving. You know, Dianne Feinstein, may she rest in peace, Pelosi, you know, McGovern. These are people who carried this torch for 50 years. They're not one way or the other. They're not going to be around that long. So we really do need a new generation to support what the young activists are doing, and it's just not sufficient. It's just not there yet. So you know, I guess that's a long way of saying that, you know, the muscle memory of, oh, well, let's go to Congress and, oh, let's pick a bill. Okay, let's pass this bill. Okay, we passed the bill. Let's all pat each other on the back and we'll see you next year. That's what's got to change. And rather than a top-down approach, a more grassroots approach seems pretty obviously in need. And again, you guys are already doing that. I just think that the people in positions of power should be giving you a lot more support. And I include the media in that, to be honest. That's my thoughts.
Well, thank you. Dibyesh?
Okay, I'll go.
Yes,
Yeah,
please,
yes.
yes.
In terms of course, there are many things you can do. Anger is good, especially when you're dealing with situation of injustice, right? Frustration is also okay, but being desperate, like, what's the point? I can't do anything is not healthy, right? So if anger is there, that's a great idea. But as Tibetan, yeah, one tendency can always be to always overthink. What can I do? I can't do anything. Things are not changing. But I said empires always fall. So, you know, just keep that hope. But what do you do now, of course, to make sure that when the right opportunity comes, Tibetan people are ready? But for that, educate, flourish, lobby, think, creative, build solidarity with others, not only Uyghurs, but also Han Chinese people. Just think of it. If you think of the resources that PRC government puts into controlling Tibet, that's very small compared to resources they put to actually control Han population itself in main area, right? So that also is a big opportunity there. Because ultimately, liberation can't come only for one people, it has to come for everyone. So that would be part. Do not give up on academia, including here. And I say as an academic that we can be quite radical and come across using the right language. It's a deeply complicit place when it comes to China and Tibet, including parts of Tibet studies. Sorry, but I'm not sorry. You know, it is complicit. Go to Tibetan studies sessions. You'll find that I've had sessions where all Tibetan panel was almost rejected on the ground that we're being very political. And the only way it could go forward was I withdrew. It was all Tibetan plus me. My panel was the missing C word, colonization. I had to withdraw that. Apparently, it was not academic enough. Except it came out as an academic paper and a published journal. That's fine. But that's how a lot of Tibet-related scholars in the West operate, all in the name of we want Tibetans from Tibet to be able to come. But that's the carrot that Chinese government dangles, and anyway they control it. So what I would say is push back against any kind of paternalism where Westerners would, and I'm saying you're also Westerner, right? But I'm also Westerner half. But Westerners would tell you, we will liberate you, like the Chinese do. You just have to be happy doing the work at lower level, but we produce the real knowledge. So ultimately, I would still say, and I know a lot of Tibetans here, is that our role as non-Tibetan scholars is mainly to make sure that we co-produce knowledge with Tibetans. We encourage Tibetans in exile to be the producers of their own knowledge. We're not withdrawing, but we be there and not speak for them. Because if we are doing that, then we end up being complicit with China. So that should give you hope because there are more and more Tibetans coming out. What should give you hope is not only you, but of course, there are people like Lobsang around who want to push back against various things and who articulate things. And what we want, of course, is many more of you. That's it. Thank you on this side.
They're commenting on the exiled Tibetans and Tibetan inside, the divide. It's an artificial construct. Empirically, 30 to 40% of Tibetans in exile were born in Tibet in late 80s and 90s, 1990s, and escaped to India. So they are family members back home. So exiled Tibetan composition is 30-40% who are from inside. In this room, if there are Tibetans, half of them I can see, I don't want to point, half of them are born in Tibet, escaped to exile, and they are today here, including these two cameramen, they were born in Tibet. So these scholars, the artificial construct, that we talk about Tibetans inside Tibet, not exiled Tibetans, they're different. It's just for their visa sake, this self-censorship. Right? Now, talking about youth, something very encouraging is happening. The artificial construct being deconstructed is Hakar, White Wednesday, right? Every Wednesday, from Toronto to New York to Delhi to Dharamsala to Lhasa to Chengdu, Tibetans dance every day, every evening. Tibetan youth, all over. It's very fashionable to wear Tibetan dress, dance, sing, and eat. So this is happening. It's like, again, bottom-up, organic revolution, assertion of your identity, your culture, your tradition. And what can Beijing do? You're dancing in the streets, right? This time with thousands, hundreds of people, So this is an assertion by Tibetan youth. It's happening. So it's saying, you just can't have the artificial construct. Now, politicization, reincarnation. Again, why we have this conference and we have to talk about geopolitics is not because Tibetans, they want to. We started the reincarnation process as individual Lama, Karmapa Pakshi, and Dalai Lamas, just for Tibetan's sake, for their own labrang, for their own monastery. The politicization happened with this golden urn in Beijing, this interference, right? So if you take, that's what I'm saying, samsara out of bodhisattva, then if you take Beijing out of reincarnation process, there's no politicization. So the argument His Holiness the Dalai made in 2011, and the argument that we are making is this is a deeply spiritual individual decision. Dalai Lama decides where and when to be born. Other Lama decides where and when to be born. That's simply his decision. And then by having this conference, we are not simply saying Beijing should not interfere. We are also saying America should not interfere. We are also saying Europe should not interfere. We are also saying India should not interfere. Not even Tibetans generally should not interfere. Let's leave His Holiness the Dalai Lama decide what he wants to do. End it or continue it, where to be born. That's a simple argument, right? That's a very deeply personal, spiritual decision. And all these other things is happening because we have to debate because of the politicization from outside, not from within. Right? So essentially, reincarnation of Dalai Lama, or reincarnation in general, is very deeply spiritual and personal decision. And if His Holiness Dalai Lama, if there's no one who can decide where and when to be born, then him, no one else.
Thank you all so much. This has been an absolutely extraordinary panel, wrapping up an absolutely extraordinary day. So please join me in giving our deepest gratitude to all three of our amazing speakers.
Good job moderating.
That was amazing, amazing. So as a final act, let me mention, this has been a truly, as I've said, and I will use the word again, extraordinary day, building on an unbelievable vision for putting together a conference, incredible papers, and with deep thanks to you all, absolutely inspiring questions. This has led to many, many questions, and many of these will be ones that we will be trying to answer in the many years to come. However, there's probably one logistical question that has arisen in your mind, and this one is very easily answerable. You have undoubtedly seen these extraordinary staff members of the Asia Center doing an incredible job. Everything is run stunningly smoothly. This was true, of course, throughout the entire invitation process, the entire workings of the room, the daily work in terms of just making everything happen. Undoubtedly, the logistical question is the following. How could any group of people work so well together and so effectively, especially when they have a director who is so idiotic and tyrannical and horrible? This question is easily answerable because we have an amazing executive director who has been, not just in these past few days, but over the past several months, working to rebuild the entire organization of the Asia Center, really build the entire spirit of the Asia Center, focused explicitly on building an incredibly powerful community where people really work together and therefore joyously do so. So, as my final act, let me introduce Rachelle Walsh, who has been an amazing executive director, and please join me in giving her our very warmest welcomes for their concluding comments.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, everyone. I won't keep you long, but what an incredible 2 days. I had very high expectations going into this conference, and it has been exceeded on all counts. And I suspect that many of you feel the same. The depth and diversity of discussion really highlighted the relevance of reincarnation in Tibetan Buddhism in not only contemporary global discourse, but showed us how it transcends not only borders, but disciplines. And that is at the heart of the Asia Center's mission. It is truly an honor for the Asia Center to have such an important conference and to have all of you here with us. I'd like to extend my deepest gratitude to all of the panelists, all of the moderators, and all of the participants. And I'd like to have a special thanks to the organizers, Janet Gyatso, Lobsang Sangay, Tenzin Nodup, the AV support staff, the Asia Center staff, as Michael mentioned, the student volunteers here at Harvard, Crimson Catering, and I'd like to also thank the generosity of our co-sponsors, the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies and their staff, the Middle Institute and their staff, and the Harvard Yenching Institute and their staff. So please join me in thanking everyone with a large round of applause. So this concludes our wonderful event. Thank you again, and safe travels for those traveling. Thanks.
Thank you all.